Mr. Williams. It's so nice to see you. I want to talk with you today about driving a motorcycle with a passenger in this city.
Yeah, okay, no problem. We can do that.
So, Kevin, am I correct in saying that riding with a passenger is generally a special, important topic? Are riders aware of this importance?
I think the carrying a passenger on a motorcycle, pillion passenger as we call them in the UK, it's an experience that most motorcycle riders will want to try out at some point. But I think it's very important to say that whenever we are carrying somebody on the back of our machine, we are taking a very, very serious responsibility on our shoulders, because when you think about it, somebody else's life is now in our hands. Now, I don't know if you have heard of a woman called Brittany Morrow. She is an American. She went out for a ride on a bike with a guy that she didn't know. He pulled a wheelie at speed. She fell off the back of the motorcycle, and she wasn't dressed to ride on the back of a motorcycle, and she suffered life-changing injuries. She's been telling her story ever since. So it's a really, really sad story for her, but it does show that there are some riders who do not think about their responsibilities when they put somebody on the back of the motorcycle. So I think, that's our starting point. We have to remember that it's not just us on the bike anymore. We are sharing that ride with somebody else. We need to be responsible for them.
Yeah, totally agree with you. So, what instructions should the rider give to the passenger before he gets on the bike with him?
Right. Well, the first thing I would say is make sure the passenger knows where to put their feet. Now, this may seem like a very stupid thing to say, but many years ago, I spent several hours removing the melted rubber from two boots from the exhaust system of my motorcycle because I'd forgotten to fold the foot pegs down where the passenger would put their feet, and she'd rested them on the exhaust system. She didn't know any better. She must have had very hot feet by the end of the ride. But yeah, I had forgotten to give her a very, very basic instruction. So yeah, they need to know where they're going to put their feet. We need to make sure the foot pegs are folded down. But then the passenger has to hold on to the bike. Now, it's important that we don't assume that they know anything at all. I've actually seen a passenger holding on to the back of a motorcycle behind them using the plastic bodywork, and when the rider braked a bit hard, they literally pulled the bodywork off the back of the bike. They also need to hold on so that they don't fall backwards if the rider accelerates a little bit harder, and they need to avoid crashing into the rider when the bike stops as well. So if there's a grab rail, show the passenger where the grab rail is. But for a complete beginner, it's usually better if they hold on to the rider. Now, my partner is pretty experienced as a passenger now. She's been around New Zealand a couple of times on a motorcycle with me, but she still prefers me to use a waist belt with grab handles on it. I'll show you that later. But it gives her something secure to grip onto. Now, it's not an elegant piece of equipment. If you have nice shiny motorcycle leathers, this thing around your waist looks pretty horrible. But they are really confidence inspiring for new riders on the back of a bike. They're not very expensive, and they really help ensure that the rider actually leans or the passenger leans with the rider when you go around corners, because one of the things that novice riders tend to do in the middle of a bend is suddenly sit upright when the bike is leaned over. Something else I'd suggest is that you tell the rider to grip the seat with their thighs when you're braking hard. That'll help them stop falling forwards into the rider. And once they're on the seat as well, it helps if they sit fairly close to the rider. If you leave a big gap, you find the sort of wind gets in between you, and it tends to blow the rider off the back of the bike at speed. So get them tucked up and it's much more comfortable. The final point is, unless there is a specifically designed luggage case at the rear of the machine that is designed for a rider to lean on, the sort of thing that you'll find on a Goldwing or a big BMW Tourer, for example, my advice is never to lean back on an ordinary top case, because it's not strong enough, and sooner or later it will break and come away. So, and the last thing, remind them not to put their feet down when the bike comes to a stop at something like traffic lights.
No, it's very interesting. And actually, I never heard about that device that you said, that stuff like this, and you need to grab here.
Okay, so this is it. If I can get it into the picture. As you can see, it's got handles here. This one is made in the UK by Oxford Products, and it's called Rider Grips, but it really does help riders who are not used to riding on the back of a motorcycle feel that they are secure, because they've got something firm to hold on to.
So, Kevin, how actually to accelerate, brake, and maneuver correctly with passenger?
One word: gently. Do everything with a lot more care than you would do when you're riding your bike on your own. When you're riding your motorcycle alone, you are holding onto the handlebars, you are gripping the tank with your knees, but the passenger doesn't have that ability to secure themselves to the bike. So basically, when we accelerate, we can't use anything like the same amount of throttle with a passenger on a sort of even just a medium-sized machine. You know, something like a 1000cc sports bike, you really will struggle to hold on if the rider even just gently accelerates the power. So you really have to be careful with bikes like this. Now, another story. Years ago, my own brother managed to dump me on my bottom in the road behind his bike, because he set off from the place where we'd met some friends a bit more quickly than I was expecting. I wasn't ready, and I fell straight off the back. So it's important to practice the smooth use of the throttle. It's incredibly easy to lose somebody off the back of a bike if you're not careful. The other side is that we have to slow down again, but once we've got a passenger on the back, we really can't brake as hard as we can solo, because the rider, again, can brace themselves on the tank. They've got the bars in front of them, but the passenger will really be struggling to hold on when we brake firmly. So we need to start braking very early. We need to give ourselves a lot more time and space so that we can brake more gently, and that means planning. So everything that we can do to avoid having to brake hard or suddenly. So everything has to be progressive. We open the throttle nice and smoothly, and we brake nice and progressively too. And you know, the other thing to remember is that when we've got a passenger on the back, the extra weight at the rear of the machine allows us to use more rear brake than normal. And if we use plenty of rear brake and not quite so much front as we would normally, one thing we find is that the front of the bike doesn't dive as much, which makes it easier to actually control the machine when we get down to slow speed. So anything else? Well, I would say, you know, if we're riding in traffic, try not to ride at really slow speeds. Something that's very useful is just wait for the car in front to move away and then ride up to the back of it and stop, rather than try to wobble along at really low speed, which a lot of people try to do. You can do that solo, it's not so difficult, but when you've got a passenger on the back, the slightest wobble from behind you and the bike will go all over the road. So it's easier to do little hops, start and stop, when traffic's moving slowly. And final thing, when we do stop, make sure the bike is upright, because if it's leaning over even slightly, all that extra weight on the back of the machine will tend to make the bike topple over sideways. And we need to watch where we're putting our feet down, because we have that extra mass on the back of the machine to control too. So we need to make sure we're not putting our foot in a pothole or onto some slippery surface. I've done that as well. I've managed to drop a bike once I forgot I was in France. We'd just come over to France from the UK. I put my foot down as I would do normally, and I put it straight into the big dip at the side of the road, and I promptly fell off with my passenger to one side. If there's one little tip which I think is quite a nice one, it's to pretend that you have an egg in an egg cup balanced on the top of your petrol tank, and that you want to keep that egg upright in that egg cup.
What about cornering on a motorcycle with a passenger? What is the most significant thing to understand?
I would say here that the most important thing is to make sure that the passenger understands that when a bike goes around a corner, it has to lean over. Again, it sounds really obvious, but it's surprising how many people who get onto the back of a motorcycle the first time have never thought of that. They may be used to traveling in a car, but they certainly aren't used to a motorcycle having to lean over. And they get really panicky because all of a sudden the ground appears to be coming up towards them. And what they usually do then is they sit upright themselves, which makes it harder to get around the corner. So it's important to warn them that what they do is that they simply lean in line with the rider. So as the rider leans over, the passenger leans too. And that way, the bike will stay nice and balanced. And again, this is where holding on to the rider can help, because the rider will naturally tend to follow the line of the rider then. I think something else that tends to help new passengers feel a little bit more connected with what's going on is to look towards the direction the bike is turning. So if you're coming up to a bend, the idea is that the rider will look the way they're going to go. But if the passenger looks as well, then they know what's coming next. You know, I've had riders who say they never open their eyes for the entire journey, but honestly, if they can get their eyes open and look, they'll feel much more comfortable on the back of the machine. And of course, with the extra weight to the rear of the bike, it will change the dynamics of the motorcycle. It will compress the back of the bike, and that does tend to make the motorcycle corner slightly differently, and it won't handle so well at low speed.
How to control a motorcycle with a passenger when you are overcoming bumps, curbs, holes, and other obstacles on the road, and what the passenger must do in this case?
Well, the first thing I'd say here is if we can spot a bump in good time, or a pothole or something else on the road that we don't want to ride over, then if we can avoid it, then that's a good thing, because obviously it makes the ride more comfortable for both of us. But if we can't avoid you know, a big bump in the road or some slippery surface, then basically we need to slow down, and we need to slow down nice and early. And if you hit a bump or go into a pothole, it's important not to be using the front brake. And the reason for this is if we do have the front brake on, we've already used up some of the suspension movement at the front, and there'll be less to absorb the bump as we hit it. So the best thing to do is actually try to slow down and then just gently open the throttle and make sure that the forks are extended, and then the full suspension travel can deal with the bump. So that's one thing I would do. Sometimes we can't avoid bumps. That, you know, lots of cities now have speed ramps in them. You know, London is littered with these speed ramps, and you have to ride over them. You can't avoid them. So the thing to try to do is when there is a bump in the road, is actually try to hit it. Oops, I'm vanishing in the green screen there, but try to hit it square on, so that we don't come in at an angle, because if we hit it at an angle, it will tend to push the wheel to the side. If we can come in square, the wheel can ride over it in a nice straight line. And obviously anything with a slippery surface, metal cover is obviously slippery, particularly when wet, polished piece of tarmac that's shiny, anything like that. We don't want to ride over that if we possibly can, because the tires might slip, and that really does upset the average passenger on the back of the bike.
Okay, and I don't know about that routes that you said, but we have a lot of holes
Right.
on our roads, holes and all that stuff. So
Yeah,
yeah.
trust me, London's pretty bad these days as well.
Yeah.
Lots of holes, and yes, lots of speed bumps as well to slow drivers down.
Okay, thank you. So, does the weight of the passenger matter, and how does it affect the ride?
Yeah, it does affect the way the bike handles, particularly with smaller motorcycles, which don't weigh much to start with. Also, sports bikes generally, something like a CBR 1000 Honda, won't handle carrying a passenger quite as well as something like a big BMW Tourer would do. The bigger bikes tend not to notice the weight so much, and if they are designed for two-up riding, like those big BMWs, then they are much easier to ride. But generally speaking, the lighter your passenger too, the easier it is to ride with them on the back of the bike, because they don't affect it so much. They don't affect the steering. So obviously, the heavier the rider gets, the more the back of the bike wants to compress. And that's why it's important to do a few adjustments to your motorcycle before you go off with a passenger on the back of it. Now, nearly every motorcycle has shock absorbers at the rear where you can adjust the preload. And basically what the preload does, if you increase it, it brings the back of the machine up a little bit higher. So that partly compensates for the extra weight of the passenger on the back of the machine. Just brings the bike back to a slightly more level position. Now, I have adjustable damping on the rear of my main bike. So what I do is I make the compression damping. That's the one that slows the bounce in the spring down when you compress the spring. I make that a little bit harder, and again, that helps to compensate for the extra weight of my partner on the back of the bike, particularly when we've also got some luggage on the bike as well. A couple of things that riders often forget. If they haven't adjusted the mirrors, as soon as they set off, they'll discover they can't see anything in them. And the other thing that will now be pointing at the sky is probably the headlights. So it may be necessary to adjust the headlights down to avoid dazzling drivers coming the other way, but also if you want to see anything at night, the headlights have to be aimed correctly. And the other thing I would just point out is that if you have a chain on your motorcycle, it's a good idea to check that the chain isn't too tight when you've got it loaded up with a passenger and possibly with luggage, because what sometimes happens is as the back of the bike compresses, the chain gets a bit too tight. So double check that. It's not quite so easy to do it on your own, but you can use something like a long stick and just reach down and see if there's actually a little bit of movement in the chain. If there's no movement at all, you do need to make the chain a little bit looser.
In your opinion, Kevin, what would be the 5 prohibitions for a passenger while driving?
Right. Okay. The first thing I'd say is be careful carrying children. Now, you can carry children on motorcycles. We have some rules in the UK about whether you can legally carry a child, one of which is that they have to be tall enough to put their feet on the foot pegs, and they have to be physically strong enough to hold on. But they also have to behave responsibly when they're on the back of a motorcycle. My best friends, they have 2 boys, children. Well, when I say children, they're now 30 years old. But when they were little, I used to take them out on the back of my motorcycle sometime. The one boy was very sensible, very young, so I took him on the back of the bike when he was just big enough to sit on the back of the bike. The other boy was a madman. He was always doing something silly. So it was 3 or 4 years later that he got his first ride on the back of my motorcycle. So, really careful not to take him on when he was going to do something silly. So yeah, be careful with children. The second thing I would say is don't get on the back of a motorcycle if you have had too many pints of beer or glasses of wine. Because you won't behave sensibly at that point, and you can put both yourself and the rider at risk. I would also say don't go on the back of a motorcycle for a ride if you don't have the correct riding kit. It's important not to wear loose, flappy clothing. Years ago, my brother gave a friend a ride home from university, and he was wearing his university scarf around his neck, and somehow the scarf got tangled in the chain, and he nearly strangled himself with it. And I was very lucky that they didn't crash. So boot laces are something else that you have to be careful with. Make sure that they are tucked into the top of the boot. They can easily come undone, and then they can flap and get caught in the chain. If you look at motorcycles sold in India, they actually have a big guard on the left-hand side of the motorcycle over the chain. And this is to stop riders with saris getting their sari caught in the chain. So, they know about the problem over there in India. Number 4, I would say don't move around as the bike is slowing down, because that is when the rider is going to struggle most to keep it balanced. And once the bike is stopped, don't move suddenly, because that will also upset the rider's balance, and it is possible that you tip the bike over. People bend down to fiddle with their shoelace or something. As I've just said, that's a bad time to do it when you're actually sat on the bike. And last of all, don't distract the rider. People try to talk to you sometimes when you're driving, and you can't really hear what they're saying, so you're kind of, trying to listen, and you're not really looking ahead at what's going on. So don't talk to the rider. If you want to have a conversation, get an intercom, or do it when you're stopped. That's the safe time to chat to the rider. Right, so those are my 5 points then.
Great, thank you very much. You said the story about the scarf, and I just remember the story about Isadora Duncan,
Oh, yes, I'd forgotten all about that. Yeah, absolutely, yes.
What would be the 5 mandatory rules for a rider driving with a passenger?
Right, okay. Well, very first thing is make sure that your motorcycle is actually suitable for carrying a passenger. Now, the first thing to say is here that some motorcycles do not have 2-person seats. They are designed for 1 person only. Some riders will have a 2-person seat, but they will have taken the foot pegs off, possibly because they fitted different exhaust pipe or something. But if the bike isn't designed for carrying a passenger, if you've removed the foot pegs, then basically you don't carry a passenger on it. It's as simple as that. The second thing I would say is that make sure your passenger is sober. The same rule really for the driver and the passenger there. And again, the third rule is very similar. I would say that make sure that if you are going to give somebody a ride on the back of your motorcycle, that they are dressed as well as you are. That if you can't give them the same kind of riding kit that you're using, you shouldn't really be carrying somebody on the back of the motorcycle. So they do need a helmet as good as the one that you're wearing as the rider, but they also need to make sure it fits. It may be that if you're carrying somebody and you give them your spare helmet, it will be completely the wrong size, and it'll be loose on their head, it will flop around. That's not going to be good if you do have a crash. Also make sure that your passenger knows how to do the helmet up. We have a number of different ways of fastening a helmet. There are the D-rings that you have to loop the strap through and then pull it tight. There are the seatbelt type fasteners. They're all a bit fiddly to use if you don't know how a helmet does up. So help the rider if they need it. And then, as I say, protective clothing. They need a good jacket. They need trousers. I would never, ever carry anybody wearing a skirt on the back of a motorcycle, and sort of thin nylon street clothes really aren't good enough either. I would always make sure that I've given them something decent to ride in. Boots as well. You know, if you're wearing trainers, that's really not good enough, and they need a pair of gloves as well.
Wow.
So yeah, I would always make sure that my passenger is kitted out as well as I am if I possibly can. And so the fourth point here really is that you need to ensure that the passenger knows what's going to happen before they get on the bike, because if they've never been on a motorcycle before, it's all new. It'll all be a bit shocking. So they need to know what they're going to do, and they need to know what you're going to do. So tell them what happens. They need to know where to hold on. We've already talked about that. And again, this may seem a silly thing to explain. If you're an experienced rider, the passenger gets on after the rider gets on, and only when the rider is ready. I've seen a bike, I'm not kidding, I've seen a motorcycle fall over when the passenger got on and the rider wasn't sitting on it. The rider was had his back to the bike and was still putting his helmet on, and the passenger climbed on the back and the bike promptly fell over. And I've also seen bikes fall over when the rider is not expecting the passenger to get off. So make sure that they're doing it when you're ready. And then it's the point five, it's that making things as smooth as possible again. One thing that you'll notice is if the passenger is nervous, they'll be very stiff, and that translates itself into how the bike handles. It won't handle so nicely. So if we take it nice and easy to start with, the passenger will start to relax, they'll start to enjoy the ride, and then we find the bike easier to control too. But you know, we really need to be very gentle with the acceleration. If you're if you're trying to stay on the back of the motorcycle via your feet up in the rider's armpits, that's not a great place to be. You really won't inspire confidence in your passenger if that's how they're holding on. So take it easy. And similarly when braking, you know, if the rider is braking so hard that the passenger is banging helmets together, then you're probably braking a bit too hard, or you definitely need to help the rider understand how they hang on. So those would be my 5 points there.
Great, thank you very much. So Kevin, you said earlier about the sad story of a girl, Brittany Morrow, who had an accident. And some beginner motorcyclists who have not yet mastered sufficient their driving skills, they immediately want to give their friend a ride. And namely, the passengers often become victims of accidents under such circumstances. Of course, the driver is to blame, but the one who sat with an inexperienced driver is also reckless. So the question is, how can a passenger know if it is safe for them to ride with this rider? And in general, after what period of time after the rider gets on the bike for the first time, he can carry a passenger?
Those are two very difficult questions to answer in some ways, but they're very good questions, and they need to be for us to think about the answers. So in terms of rider experience, now I had been riding for about 1.5 years when I took my girlfriend on the back of my motorcycle for the very first time. So I wasn't particularly experienced, but I had passed my motorcycle test here in the UK. I had ridden from one end of the country to the other. I had ridden in London. So I had some idea of what I was doing at that point. I wasn't a complete beginner. So it's hard to say exactly how much experience you should have, because you know, some riders will ride a lot in a very short time and they'll pick up experience very quickly. Other riders will, you know, do very few kilometers each year. They won't travel very far, so they may have had a bike for 3 or 4 years but hardly ridden it. So it's hard to say in terms of months and years. But if you feel that you are not comfortable riding a bike in a particular situation, perhaps example would be if you're a rider who lives in the country and you're not happy going to a big city, or you're not happy riding up a motorway, I would say then that would be a something that would make me think very much twice about carrying a passenger. And the same, if you're not experienced at riding on mountain roads, for example, I wouldn't go onto those kind of roads for the very first time with a passenger on the back of my motorcycle. I want to find out how the bike works on around hairpin bends and up steep slopes before I try to carry a passenger. So get some experience on roads that are easy to ride, first of all. In dry, sunny, fine weather, that would be a really good idea too, so that you make things as easy as possible for yourself when you carry a passenger for the first time on the back of the bike. Something I would avoid doing as a new driver with a passenger on the back is filtering or lane splitting, because it means you're very close to cars, and if you make the slightest accident, slightest mistake in your riding, you may end up hitting a car. And if you think about it, the passenger on the back, their knees stick out further out than you do, so you can filter through a gap and you can bang your passenger's knee on a car either side of you. So again, it needs to be thought about carefully before we do things like this. So keep it simple, learn how the bike and the passenger respond on nice, easy roads. And the other thing I'd say is when you set off on a longer ride, don't forget the passenger will get tired a lot more quickly than you do on the front of the bike. It's very hard work hanging on to the back of a motorcycle for a long distance. Now, if you are the passenger and you're wondering about whether or not it's time to go on the back of the motorcycle for the first time, then I would say, first of all, think very hard about riding with someone you don't know. That was the mistake that Brittany Morrow made. She liked the guy. She thought it'd be fun to go for a ride with him, and it went very, very bad for her indeed. So I would say get some practice with a rider that you do know and a rider that you trust, somebody with some experience. If you have a friend who already takes a girlfriend or a wife, partner on the back of the machine, then maybe ask them to take you out and explain how it works before you go out with your own friend or partner who's never taken somebody on the back of a motorcycle before. Look at the bike you're going to go for a ride on too. As I said, some motorcycles have very, very small passenger seats, and they really aren't great for trying to sit on the back of if you're a novice. They're not very confidence inspiring. At the risk of pointing a finger at a particular motorcycle, the reason I would not buy the Trident 660 Triumph is the rear seat. Look at it. It is tiny. It's a horrible little thing, and I certainly wouldn't go anywhere near that if I was a passenger, and I wouldn't try and put somebody on the back of that bike myself. Think about the riding kit that you're going to need. Are you going to buy it yourself? Are you going to rely on somebody to lend it to you? If it is bought, you can make sure it fits you. But if you're borrowing from somebody, you need to know that the helmet in particular is going to be a good fit and a good quality helmet. If the helmet looks like it's probably had a flower pot stuck in it for the last 2 years, I probably wouldn't want to have that on my head. So look at the kit and think about what you're going to use. And the other thing, the absolute no-no is don't take a ride from someone that you suspect might have been drinking or taking drugs. Find another way home. It's sometimes very tempting because you might have to wait a long time for public transport, or maybe you'll have to get a taxi, which will be expensive, and somebody offers you a ride on the bike. Well, if you've been to a club or something, ask yourself very carefully, are they fit to ride that bike? And if there's any other way to get home, and you then think about using it. So yeah, done right, riding with a passenger is a great experience, great way to travel, to have somebody with you as you enjoy the roads. But done badly, honestly, nobody will enjoy the trip, and it can end badly.
Thank you very much for your valuable and clear explanations and for taking the time for our interview.
You're very welcome indeed, Maria. Thank you indeed for the opportunity to talk to everybody again on your channel. Thank you indeed.